Hey, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you for being here and also those that are connected on the internet. Today we start a new book, which is Mickey's
Which
favorite, Leviticus. So
what is
we're going to be talking about that, the first 6 chapters. But before we start the class, um, so as I was saying before we start reading the Torah portion, let's do the blessing. And it says like this. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok divrei Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with your commandments and commanded us to engage ourselves in the words of the Torah. Amen. And so as I was saying, today we start a new book called the Book of Leviticus or Vayikra. And we'll be reading from chapter 1, verse 1, all the way to chapter 6, verse 7. And also, if you had a chance to read the prophet, the section for the prophet today is Isaiah chapter 43, verse 21 through chapter 44, verse 23. And I highly recommend that you read it because it's a beautiful, beautiful portion from Isaiah. Okay, so today, like I was saying, we start a new book, which is the book of Leviticus or Vayikra. The way it's called in Hebrew is Vayikra, and Vayikra means, and he called, and he called. Now it's interesting that it's in the Hebrew, it has the word, the Vav, which means and. In other words, the book of Vayikra is a continuation of the book of Exodus or the book of Shemot. Why? Because remember then the book of Exodus, starting from chapter 25 forward, the Lord is speaking about the sacred space, which is the Mishkan or the tabernacle, which once they get to the land is going to be what's called the temple. Therefore, this is something very important because there's a lot of chapters dedicated to just this sacred space. So let's start reading in chapter 1, verse 1. And it says, and the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the Mishkan or the tabernacle of meeting, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of the livestock, of the herd, and of the flock. In other words, what is he trying to say? That now that he has established the nation, now that he has established the Mishkan or the tabernacle, he's establishing what's called a protocol to teach us how to approach him. Okay, now remember that this Mishkan is a sacred space because we have a holy God that's living, dwelling there among a holy nation. And so therefore, to sustain and maintain this holiness, this sacred space, he's now formulating a protocol, a way, a procedure so that we can maintain this holiness or this sacred space. Why? Because only in holiness can God dwell. If there's no holiness, he cannot be there. So he's talking about these offerings, and we have to remember that the term offering in Hebrew is the word korban, not sacrifice. Unfortunately, the term korban has been incorrectly translated as sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice. And I'm going to share with you my screen just to go over some of these terms. They'll hopefully will help you understand a little bit better. So as I was saying is Leviticus chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 7. And the prophet is Isaiah chapter 43, verse 21 through 44, verse 23. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend that you read the portion in Isaiah because it's very, very beautiful. So as I was saying, the Lord gives an instruction. And he's saying that when Adam, in the Hebrew says when Adam or a person or a man or human being wants to come near, wants to approach the Lord, is the term yakriv. Yakriv means to come near, which from where we get the word korban. Korban is what's translated as an offering, not a sacrifice. Why? Because korban means to come near, to come close, to approach, to be an offering. It is not a sacrifice. Why is it not a sacrifice? Because a sacrifice is what pagans do or make to appease or manipulate their gods. Not so with the God of Israel. Again, the term sacrifice is related to the pagan culture and the way they come or approach their gods. And usually they do it with the sense of to appease or to manipulate. But with the God of Israel, we bring a korban, an offering. Why? Because that's the way to relate to Hashem in his house. Remember that the term house is his temple, his dwelling place, or his sacred space. And it's all about relationship. Either we bring a korban for celebration, like in the festivals, for thankfulness, because you're thankful for something, or to repair the relationship with God and or another person, to elevate or to bring tikkun. Tikkun is the Hebrew word that refers to correction, to restoration, to bringing things back to the way they were. So this protocol, for example, we're going to see as we read, if it's an animal, it has to be a domestic and a clean animal, what we will call a kosher animal. And the blood is put on the altar. If it's not an animal, it has to be a high quality grain, and that has to be brought with frankincense, oil, but no leaven and no honey. If it's birds, these can be either pigeons or turtle doves. Okay, so let's continue reading in verse 3. If his offering is a burnt sacrifice, a burnt offering of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own free will at the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord. So if it's from the herd, that means it can be, if it's male, it has to be a bull. Okay, he can bring a bull or he can bring a calf, that's a male. It's free will, it's voluntary. And he says in verse 4, then he shall put his hand on the head of the burnt offering. So this burnt offering is the first of the 5 offerings, the basic offerings that the Lord is going to talk about. This burnt offering in the Hebrew is the term olah, olah, okay? It's the term olah, which means it's translated as a burnt offering. It's completely burnt on the altar, is not eaten. No one participates of this offering except it's a complete offering unto the Lord. So it's called olah. So he says, then he shall put his hand on the head of the burnt offering, on the animal. The owner is putting the hand on the head of the animal, not to transfer sins. This is not a transfer of anything. The hand on the animal, on the head of the animal, is showing that that animal is his and he's giving it to the Lord. Okay, he's giving this offering to the Lord. So putting the hand on the animal is to show ownership, is no transfer of any sin. And then he says in verse 5, it says, I'm continue, it says, and the head, he will put his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him, or kaper. And we'll see what kaper means in a little bit. And then he shall kill the bull before the Lord and the priest. In other words, this offering, the person himself that's bringing the offering can slaughter the animal. But that's all he can do, because once the blood has to be taken by the priest. The blood is only manipulated by the priest. No one else can do that. That's why it says, and the priest, Aaron's sons, shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood all around on the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of meeting. So the blood of that animal is going to go to the altar. And then he shall skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire on the altar and lay the wood in order on the fire. Then the priest, Aaron's sons, shall lay the parts, the head and the fat in order on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. But he shall wash its entrails, in other words, its organs, and its legs with water, and the priest shall burn all on the altar as a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. So here's describing all the steps involved with this particular offering, which is the olah, which is going to be completely burnt. Now the olah can be brought during a festival. It can be brought as a Thanksgiving offering. It can be brought because you have a petition before the Lord. Okay, so basically those are, and it's a voluntary offering. And then it goes to, if you bring an offering in verse 10 from the flocks, either a sheep or a goat, and it's the same procedure, the same thing as we talked about with the bull. In verse 14, and if the burnt offering of his offering to the Lord is of birds, then he shall bring his offering of turtle doves or young pigeons, because the bird is small. It's a small animal. The way it's offered is a little bit different. It says in verse 15, the priest shall bring it to the altar, wring off its head and burn it on the altar. Its blood shall be drained out at the side of the altar, and he shall remove its crop with its feathers and cast it beside the altar on the east side into the place for the ashes. Then he shall split it at its wings, but shall not divide it completely, and the priest shall burn it on the altar, on the wood that is on the fire. It is a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. I'm going to go back here. Let's see if I can go back. I know some people don't like the book of Leviticus because of all the animals that have to be offered, but we need to understand this is a protocol that the Lord has ordained. It has nothing to do whether we like it or we don't. Why? Because the blood, the life is in the blood. Therefore, the issue is that this is a sacred space, and the only way that the sacred space can maintain and sustain its sacredness, is holiness, is using the blood of an animal as a detergent or something to decontaminate the sacred spaces. In other words, sin causes a contamination physically, even though it cannot be seen. It causes a contamination of all the sacred space, of all the sections within the Mishkan or in the temple. And the only way to get rid of that contamination is by offering blood on the altar, because that blood from the animal that a person gives is going to unite you with God through that blood on the altar. It's to repair a relationship with the Lord, or to show your gratitude to the Lord by doing this. So again, the blood is not about death, but life, because the blood of this animal, if it's an animal that's being offered, is pure and uncontaminated. You're giving something that is yours as a gift or a tribute or an offering to the Lord. And kaper, when it's an offering that has to do with what's translated as atonement, in the Hebrew means to shield, to cover, to wipe out contaminants so that we can come near and not die in the presence of a holy God, holy and pure God. Because why? Relationship, covenant. You want to be able to continue to have a relationship and be in covenant with the Lord. And the only way that we can do this protocol that the Lord established is through an offering. And so I was saying there are 5 different types of offerings with their own protocols. Why? Because every offering is going to be what you're going to offer, how you're going to offer it, when you're going to offer it, who offers it, why, where, and if it's voluntary or involuntary. The term zavach in Hebrew means that it's an offering that requires slaughtering, which in the Hebrew is the word shechita. And the menochot are offerings that are not animals, they're grain. So you can either bring an animal or you can bring grain, especially people that were very, very, very poor. They could not afford an animal. The Lord says, okay, so just bring me some grain. The thing is that there's something that you can always bring to the Lord because you're interested in maintaining that relationship and maintaining that covenant. The purpose of all this is to keep that relationship with the Lord. Okay, so that's why he comes up with this protocol. In chapter 2, talks about, in the English it says grain offering. In the Hebrew is the term mincha, mincha. And it says, when anyone offers a grain offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour, and he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. He shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priest, one of whom shall take from it his handful of fine flour and oil with all the frankincense. And the priest shall burn it as a memorial on the altar, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. So let's say you bring flour. It has to be the finest flour, just not any flour, the finest flour. So let's say you bring like an omer or 2 pounds of flour. The priest takes a handful to include oil and frankincense, and that is burnt on the altar as a memorial. Okay, now the rest of that grain is going to the priest that's officiating that offering, because it says in verse 3, the rest of the grain offering shall be Aaron's and his sons. It is most holy of the offerings to the Lord made by fire. Now this mincha, this grain, can be brought baked. You can make it in like baked cakes, but it says you cannot put leaven on it, and you have to mix it with flour. The flour with oil, or unleavened wafers anointed with oil. So you can bring it baked like a wafer. You can fry it in a pan according to verse 5. You can boil it. So depending on how you bring this grain, there's basically several forms that you can bring it. And either way, the priest is going to take just a portion, put that on the altar, and then the rest of it belongs to the priest. And it says, go to verse 11 in chapter 2. It says, no grain offering which you bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven, for you shall burn no leaven nor any honey in any offering to the Lord made by fire. As for the offering of the first fruits, you shall offer them to the Lord, but they shall not be burned on the altar for sweet aroma. In other words, you cannot put leaven or honey on the grain that you're bringing as an offering, because that's going to go on the altar. But you can bring honey and you can bring leaven as a first fruits offering. Okay, let's say you have honey, you have bees at home, and then you have this whole bunch of honey, and you bring a first fruit of that honey. You bring it as an offering of first fruit, but that first fruit is not going to be put on the altar, because you never put on the altar honey and leaven. But you can bring it as a first fruit, and that's going to go to the priest. Verse 13. And every offering of your grain offering you shall season with salt. You shall not allow the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt. So salt was always put on the offering. That's why on Shabbat we put salt on the bread that we're going to eat. Why? Because on Shabbat, our Shabbat table represents the altar. And the bread is the offering that we receive from the Lord, the blessing that we receive from the Lord. And so we salted. Why? Because it's a reminder of the salt covenant, which means, the salt is for keeping things fresh, allowing them to not spoil. It means it doesn't ferment. It keeps it fresh, and it means permanence. Okay, it's a permanent covenant. Verse 14, if you offer grain offering of your first fruits to the Lord, you shall offer for the grain offering of your first fruits green heads of grain roasted on the fire, grain beaten from full heads. In other words, like right now that we're going to start celebrating Passover during this season, in Israel, the grain that comes out, the first grain of the harvest is barley. So once the barley is ready, you would bring it as a first fruit. And it says, if you bring the green heads, let's say of the barley, it has to be roasted on fire and then beaten. And that's what you're going to offer unto the Lord. You're going to put oil on it and lay frankincense on it. But the priest is the one that shall burn the memorial portion of its beaten grain and part of its oil, and with all the frankincense as an offering made by fire to the Lord. Again, this one also is voluntary. So the mincha is a grain offering, cereal, the best quality flour with frankincense, no leaven and no honey, and it's voluntary. Okay. And we need to understand that these offerings are not related to sin. They're not related to sin. Shelamim, the Shelamim offering, it's the third one, chapter 3. When his offering is an offering of peace, or in other translations, it says of well-being. If he offers it of the herd, whether male or female, he shall offer it without blemish before the Lord. So this peace offering can be either a male or a female from the herd. In other words, a cow or a bull. He shall lay his hand on it, on the head of his offering, and kill it at the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and Aaron's sons, the priest, shall sprinkle the blood all around on the altar, the same way as the olah offering. So the person that owns the animal has to put his hand on the head to show ownership that I'm giving this to the Lord as an offering. Then that person himself can slaughter the animal if they want. But it's the priest who takes the blood and sprinkles it on the altar. Verse 3, then he shall offer from the offering of the peace offering an offering made by the fire to the Lord. The fat that covers the entrails and all the fat that is on the entrails, the 2 kidneys and the fat that is on them by the flanks, and the fatty lobe attached to the liver above the kidneys he shall remove. So the thing is that there's a specific kind of fat around the organs, especially the kidneys and the liver, that cannot be eaten by anybody. That has to be burnt on the altar because that's a special offering unto the Lord. It's what sometimes people call the brown fat. It's a different fat than what we usually eat, like we're eating chicken or steak or something. Verse 5, and Aaron's son shall burn it on the altar upon the burnt offering, which is on the wood that is on the fire, as an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. And remember that the Shelamim is the only offering that the person that brings it can participate of it. So the Shelamim is a peace or well-being offering, is shared with the officiating priest, with family and friends, and it's also voluntary. Okay, for example, the Passover lamb is a Shelamim. Why? Because people that bring the lamb are able to eat of it. That's a Shelamim offering. Verse 6, if his offering is an offering of peace to the Lord of the flock, it can be either a male or female without blemish. It can be a lamb, as it says in verse 7. It can be a goat, as it says in verse 12, and it's the same procedure. Same procedure. You do the same steps, whether it's a cow, a bull, a lamb, or goat, as a Shelamim offering. Verse 17, this shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations in all your dwellings. You shall eat neither fat nor blood, but the fat that he's talking about is the fat that we already mentioned, that's around the kidneys and the liver and around the organs. But you also burn the kidneys and the liver. Why? Because in this culture, the pagan cultures would use the kidneys and the liver to make divination. They would cut them in pieces and then throw them up in the air, and however they fell, they would say that this was giving them some omen or something, and they were able to come up with a divination. So the Lord says, you don't do that. You burn these things on the altar. Okay. And that shalamim is a voluntary offering. Then we go into the other two, which is the chatat and the sham. The chatat is incorrectly translated as a sin offering. It is not a sin offering. It's a purification offering. The chatat is the purification offering, and it varies. It varies depending on the offense. And this one has to be obligatory. It's involuntary. You have to bring it. If you commit something that's labeled within the chatat, you have to bring this. There's no choice. You have no option. You have to always bring this. And it says in chapter 4. Now the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the children of Israel saying, now this is going to be the causes for why you bring a purification offering. If a person sins unintentionally, that is important, unintentionally, against any of the commandments of the Lord in anything which ought not to be done, and does any of them, and then it's going to tell you that depending on the person is the type of offering they're going to bring. Remember, this is unintentional. Why? Because intentional sins, like for example, adultery, murdering, homosexuality, incest, and other things, it was punished with death. So there was no offering for those things. So that's why the Lord is specifically saying if it's unintentional. And the first example is of the high priest. Let's say the high priest commits an unintentional sin against one of the commandments that he was not supposed to commit. It says, if the anointed priest, which is the high priest, sins, bringing guilt on the people, then let him offer to the Lord for his sin, which he has sinned, a young bull, without blemish, as a remember that is not a sin offering, it's a purification offering. He shall bring the bull to the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord, lay his hand on the bull's head, and kill the bull before the Lord. Then the anointed priest shall take some of the bull's blood and bring it to the tabernacle of meeting. The priest shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary. This is the veil that's in front of the ark. Why? Because this is what we need to understand. The higher the responsibility of the individual, like the high priest has the highest responsibility and has the highest grade of holiness. Therefore, his sins are going to contaminate deeper into the sanctuary. The higher the responsibility, the deeper the contamination goes into the sanctuary. That is why the priest has to take part of that blood and sprinkle it on the curtain that's right in front of the ark. And it says in verse 7, and the priest shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of sweet incense before the Lord. Plus, he has to put some of the blood of that offering on the horns of the altar of incense. So what he's doing this from inside out. Okay. Which is in the tabernacle of meeting, and he shall pour the remaining blood of the bull at the base of the altar of the burnt offering. In other words, on the base of the altar that's outside. Okay, so he's going from inside out. Why? Because of his position within the community. Any sin that he commits unintentional, his offering has to start from inside out. The cleansing of that contamination of that sin has to be cleansed from inside out. He shall take, verse 8, he shall take from it all the fat of the bull as the purification offering, the fat that covers the entrails and all the fat which is on the entrails. The 2 kidneys, the flanks, it's the same, similar to what was done before. But the difference is, verse 11, but the bull's hide and all its flesh with its head and legs, its entrails and offal, The whole bull he shall carry outside the camp to a clean place, where the ashes are poured out and burnt on the wood with fire. Where the ashes are poured out, it shall be burned. So the difference is that the bull itself, the whole bull, has to be taken out and burned outside of the sanctuary. Only the blood goes on the altars from inside out. Now, if it's the whole congregation that sins, again, unintentionally, and then they realize it, they too must bring a bull, and it's the same procedure. The only thing that the elders or the leaders of the community are the ones that are going to put their hand on the bull's head, saying it belongs to the community, but the rest of the procedure is the same. This blood also goes on. It says in verse 17, then the priest shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil, which is the veil that's in front of the ark. So it's going to be the same procedure as the offering of the high priest. Same thing, nothing changes. Verse 22, if it's a ruler or a leader that sins unintentionally, he needs to bring a goat, a male goat without blemish. Verse 24, and he shall lay his hand on the head of the goat and kill it at the place where they killed the burnt offering before the Lord. It is a purification offering. The priest shall take some of the blood of the purification offering with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar, a burnt offering, and pour its blood at the base of the altar, a burnt offering. So if it's a leader or a ruler, the blood goes on the horns of the altar that's outside. Okay, why? Because a leader doesn't have the same greater responsibility as the high priest or the elders of all the community. And it's the same procedure. Verse 27, if it's the common people, anybody within the community, again, sins unintentionally. What I want you to always remember, this is unintentional. They can bring a kid of the goats, a female. And also the blood of this female is going to go on the horns of the altar that are outside the tent of meeting. They can bring also a lamb, a female lamb. They can also bring a female goat or a female lamb, and it's the same procedure. This is if it's someone from the community that unintentionally needs to commits a sin that's considered within the unintentional, they bring what's called the purification offering. So chapter 5 is going to deal with what's called the asham. Some places they call it trespass or a guilt offering. The Hebrew word is asham, and the correct translation should have been reparation or restitution offering. And it's going to vary depending on the offense. This one too is obligatory. It's not voluntary. And these are the things why you bring a sham offering. Chapter 5, verse 1. If a person sins in hearing the utterance of an oath and is a witness, whether he has seen or known of the matter, if he does not tell it, he bears guilt. Or if a person touches any unclean thing, whether the carcass of an unclean beast or the carcass of an unclean livestock or the carcass of unclean creeping things, and he isn't aware of it, he also shall be unclean and guilty. So this has to do with ritual purity. He's become ritually impure. Or if he touches human uncleanness, for example, a woman that's menstruating. Someone touches a woman that's menstruating, becomes ritually impure. Whatever uncleanness with which a man may be defiled and he is unaware of it, when he realizes it, then he shall be guilty. Or if a person swears, speaking thoughtlessly with his lips to do evil or to do good, whatever it is that a man may pronounce by an oath, and he is unaware of it, when he realizes it, then he shall be guilty in any of these matters. So if you see, these things are really not that bad, except unless you're falsely, you don't defend somebody when you know they're innocent and you don't say nothing. But most of it, this is mostly like for ritual impurity. Verse 5. And it shall be when he is guilty of in any of these matters that he shall confess that he has sinned in that thing. So this type of offering requires confession. Verse 6, and he shall bring his trespass or reparation offering to the Lord for his sin, which he has committed, a female from the flock, a lamb or a kid of the goats as a purification offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him concerning his sin. But if he's not able to bring a lamb, he can bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. And again, like the bird olah offering in verse 8, he shall bring them to the priest, who shall offer that which is for the sin offering first, and wring off its head from its neck, but shall not divide it completely. Then he shall sprinkle some of the blood of the sin offering on the side of the altar, and the rest of the blood shall be drained out at the base of the altar. It is again, it's not a sin offering, it's a purification offering. And he shall offer the second bird as a burnt offering according to the prescribed manner. If he's still not able to bring 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, in other words, he doesn't have the finances, the resources to bring any of the other offerings. He's so poor. The Lord still gives him an opportunity, and he says he can bring 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour. But this one has no oil or any frankincense in it, for it is a purification offering. Then he shall bring it to the priest, and the priest shall take his handful of it as a memorial portion and burn it on the altar. And the rest of it goes to the priest. And then in verse 14 forward, it's still an asham offering, but this one is going to be, you need to add to it 20% of the value of whatever is being put in question. Okay? Besides being a trespass, you also have to do a restitution by giving 20% of the value of whatever is the issue. So verse 14 says, then the Lord spoke to Moses saying, if a person commits a trespass and sins again unintentionally in regard to the holy things of the Lord, then he shall bring to the Lord as his trespass offering a ram without blemish from the flocks, with your valuation in shekels of silver according to the shekel of the sanctuary, as a trespass offering. And he shall make restitution. So what does this mean? Let's say a person eats something that was very, very holy and wasn't meant for that individual. It was something that was supposed to be eaten by the priest that belonged to the Lord, and he unknowingly eats it. Let's say it was, the bread that was taken out of the temple on Shabbat, that you had to replace it with fresh bread every Shabbat. That can only be eaten by the priest. Let's say for whatever reason, you got hold of a loaf of that bread and you ate it. That would be an asham offering to make restitution. So you would have to, based on the value of that bread, you would have to make an offering, plus you had to add 1/5 or 20% of the value of that bread. Let's say that bread was $10. So besides paying the $10 for the bread, you have to add to that 20% more. Okay, why? Because you ate something that was not meant to be eaten by any other person except the priest. That's an example. Okay. So, and he shall make restitution from the harm that he has done in regard to the holy thing, and shall add 1/5 to it and give it to the priest. So the priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the trespass offering, and it shall be forgiven him. Then in verses 17, another situation. It says, if a person sins and commits any of these things which are forbidden to be done by the commandments of the Lord, though he does not know it, Yet he is guilty and shall bear his iniquity. And he shall bring to the priest a ram without blemish from the flock, and with your valuation as a trespass offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him regarding his ignorance, in which he erred and did not know it, and it shall be forgiven. It is a trespass offering or a restitution offering. He has certainly trespassed against the Lord. Chapter 6 is still part of the Asham offering, other different situations. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, if a person sins and commits a trespass against the Lord by lying to his neighbor about what was delivered to him for safekeeping, or about a pledge, or about a robbery, or if he has extorted from his neighbor, or if he has found what was lost and lies concerning it and swears falsely, in any one of these things that a man may do in which he sins, then it shall be, because he has sinned and is guilty, that he shall restore what he has stolen, or the thing which he has extorted, or what was delivered to him for safekeeping, or the lost thing which he found, or all that about which he has sworn falsely. He shall restore its full value, add 1/5. So again, it's about restoration. And to that, still he has to add 20%. Verse 6, and he shall bring his trespass offering to the Lord, a ram without blemish from the flock, with your valuation as a trespass offering to the priest. So the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord, and he shall be forgiven for any one of these things that he may have done in which he trespasses. Now you're going to say, why do we need to know these things? Because even though we're not doing these things, because first of all, there is no temple. Number two, through Messiah Yeshua, his blood, his offering, the difference between Yeshua's offering himself and these offerings is that with these offerings, you basically are decontaminating the physical Mishkan or the physical temple. Okay, so just to give a little recap, there are 7 kinds of offerings based on Kedusha and the holiness of the offering. The burnt offering or the olah is considered most holy. The sin offering, which is really the purification offering, in the Hebrew is chatat, is also considered most holy. The guilt or reparation offering, in Hebrew asham, is also considered most holy. What does that mean? Remember that the burnt offering has to be burnt completely. Nobody participates of that. But these 2 offerings, the chatat and the asham, the priest has to partake of these offerings. Part of that offering, he has to eat of it to make it a complete offering. And because it's of the most holy offerings, that means that the priest has to eat it within the temple, the sanctuary, in a specific place. He cannot take that meat and go outside the gates of the temple and eat it at home. That would be a big no-no. It has to be exactly where the Lord said you have to eat it. Why? Because of the holiness of that offering. But the peace offering, the shalomim, which includes a thanksgiving offering. Let's say you are thankful for something. You're thankful that you survived COVID. You're thankful that you survived whatever. You would bring a peace offering. And this one is considered less holy, which meant, remember, this is the one that can be shared with other people. That you would bring it to the altar. The priest would pour the blood on the altar. Then he would give you back the animal. It would be roasted and you would eat it, part of it, with your family and friends within the gates of Jerusalem. Okay, not outside Jerusalem. It had to be eaten within the gates of Jerusalem, not necessarily within the temple area. Okay, so this peace offering, again, is considered less holy. Why? Because you can eat it outside the temple. The firstborn offering is also considered less holy. The animal tithe were also considered less holy. And the Pesach, the Passover lamb, is considered less holy. Why? Because it's a shalomim. You can eat it outside the temple in the homes. Okay. So this is in comparison to these, not because they're not holy. It's just that in comparison to these three, which are most holy, these have to be eaten in a specific place within the temple with the priest. Okay. The four main service elements was the slaughtering. And again, this can be done by the person that brings the animal, including women. But if you don't want to slaughter the animal, the priest will slaughter it for you. Okay, so this part, once you've put your hand on the animal and declared ownership, okay, this is my lamb and I'm offering to the Lord, you could slaughter the animal or the priest could slaughter it. But once the animal was slaughtered, the blood is what's the only, from that point on, only the priest continues. Okay, the rest is done by the priest. He collects the blood in a holy vessel, a specific vessel made for that. You just don't come and grab a Dixie cup and use it as, no, it has to be specific utensils for all the offerings. Then he would take the blood to the altar, sprinkle it, depending on the offering. There were certain ways of putting that blood. Again, depending on the offering, the altar had a red line around it. There was a red line around the altar, and that will let you know that some of the blood, some cases, some offerings, the blood had to be sprinkled below that line, while others had to be sprinkled above that line on the altar. Okay, so these were very specific protocols, and these are all given by the Lord. This is not something that's man-made. God requested this. So even if you don't like it, you don't like the idea of these animals being slaughtered, you don't like the idea of these little baby lambs and all these things, doesn't matter. It's not our option, it's not our choice, it's what God commanded. As for the birds, there's only two elements with the birds. Pinching the bird's head off, and that's put on the altar, and wringing out the blood, making sure that all the blood is drained out of that bird. Remember, these are small animals. And another thing is that all these offerings had to be done by the priest with the right intention. While the priest is manipulating the blood and doing the offerings, he cannot be thinking, oh, I forgot to pay the water bill. Because just by those thoughts, if he's not concentrated in what he's doing, he invalidates that offering. And you have to understand that he's representing the person that brought that offering to the Lord. And of course, nobody can read the priest's mind. Only God knows what he's thinking. So his intention has to be right on what he's doing, because if not, he invalidates the offering. So with right intention when performing service to avoid invalidating it, only during daytime and only with the right hand. All the offerings had to be done before sunset. Why? In comparison to the pagan rituals that they made a lot of their offerings at night. Why? Because they made a lot of offerings to gods related to death. So they did them at night. Also, the priests always had to use their right hand when doing any of the elements of the offering. Even if the person was left-handed, he had to learn how to do everything with his right hand. If not, it wasn't acceptable. Why? Because God said so. And these references, if you're interested in more detail, you can go to the Mishnah Kehati in the Seder called Kodashim, Volume 1, in the tractate called Zevachim. This is all related to the offerings. It gives you more detail if you're interested. And again, the animals that were offered had to be domestic and had to be clean, like the sheep, rams, goats. They could either be male or female, like we read, depending on the type of offering. Some of them had to be strictly male, others had to be strictly female, others could be either one. The pigeon and the turtle dove were the only birds that could be brought as an offering. If you remember, if you remember when Miriam, Yeshua's mom, came to the temple, she brought turtle doves. Why? It was an offering for ritual impurity. At 40 days after having had Yeshua, the law says, the Torah says, every woman that has a son At 40 days, she has to come to the temple and purify herself. So what we read here, this is part of the Asham offering, purification offering, meant that when they brought these turtle doves is because financially they didn't have a lot of money. They couldn't bring a ram, they couldn't bring a bull, they couldn't bring a lamb. I mean, they brought a lamb, but this one was not to be offered at that time. Okay, so they brought turtle doves just to show you that they were financially, they were not very rich. Okay, and so this is just to show you here the priest had a scale where with his fingernail he could cut off the head of the bird, and the crop had to be removed along with the feathers. He would have to split the bird, and then it was offered on the altar after he had drained all the blood. And here, just to show you, this is a cow where the fat of the kidneys and the liver and the fat that's covering the organs, that belonged to the Lord. You always had to put that on the altar. This type of fat could not be eaten by anybody. This is the fat that the Lord is talking about, the fat that is on the kidneys, the liver, and over the organs. Also, the kidneys and the liver were burnt on the altar. Why? Because these two organs were used by pagans to do a divination. So the Lord says, you don't do that. You have to burn these completely so people don't think that you're doing the same as pagan worshipers. So you burn these things on the altar. And a goat or a lamb, the sheep, there was a special kind of sheep in Israel during this time where the tail of the sheep had a lot of fat. So that meant that this fat and the fat that's over the flank, and again, the fat over the kidneys and the liver and around the organs had to be burnt on the altar. These could not be eaten by anybody. The same way with blood. You don't need the blood, and you don't need this type of fat, which is usually kind of brown. It's a very brown, rich fat that belongs to the Lord. I don't know if you can see this or not, but this is kind of letting you know the purification offering was called the sin offering, is telling you what we had said, that if it was a high priest, if it was the community, if it was a ruler or a leader, or if it was a common person, depending on who the individual was and the responsibilities, it was a type of offering they were going to bring, and it was certain specific places where you put the blood of that offering. Okay, so there's very specific protocols on doing certain things. You just didn't do things at your own pleasure or how you thought it should be. God established these protocols. Why? And why is it so detailed and so meticulous and so specific? Because remember, God wants us to maintain the sanctity, the holiness of this sacred space. Why? Because sin contaminates his home. And he cannot be in a home where it's contaminated, it's filthy because of the sin. So this was used as a cleansing agent, this blood of these animals. Okay, that's why when Solomon, after building the first temple, he broke covenant to a point that God, his glory, his visible presence left. And since that moment on, the visible presence of the Lord has not been seen again like it was seen in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, and in the first temple. So that's why people in Israel, especially the religious Jews, want a third temple, because they want that glory to come back. They want that visible presence to come back. Okay, because the same way that the Jews were sent to exile, so did the presence of the visible presence of the Lord. And this one is also explaining again the purification and the Asham offerings. Two are specifically for purification, and one is for reparation, the ones that you have to give 20% above the offering. So why all this stuff? Why do this? Why? Because this protocol of these offerings of the Mishkan of the temple are a fulfillment of the covenant to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This maintaining the sacred space, let's say the temple had never been profaned, the temple, people did the things the way they were supposed to have been, It would have brought us a society based on the sanctity and the equal dignity of all. We would all be subject to the sovereignty of Hashem alone. We will be constantly conscious of the divine presence, of the kavod, the glory, the Shekhinah. We will be striving to be true and faithful to the covenant that charged us with being a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. We will be ascending the soul to heaven and bringing heaven down to earth in the form of a just, gracious, and compassionate social order. We will be forever having the identity in the image and likeness of Elohim. This is paradise. This is Eden. This is the way things should have kept being. But because of sin, because of our faults, the Lord had to come up with something to clean his house until Yeshua was able to come and give his offering. Why? Because all these things that were done here cleansed superficially, but none of the blood of these animals could get into the heart and the conscience and the mind of the individuals. Only the blood of Messiah Yeshua did that. Okay, so only through Yeshua that we get not only the cleansing external of all this contamination of sin, but also what was in our heart. Because you have to remember that the only person that can see what's in our heart is the Lord. And all sin starts in the heart. You can fool everybody else, but we cannot fool the Lord. So Yeshua's blood is, so this was like a precursor to what Yeshua was going to do. But still, that doesn't take away that there won't be a future temple. Why? Because the purpose of the future temple, if you read Ezekiel from chapter 40 all the way to chapter 4, I think 48 or 49, there's still going to be offerings, but these offerings are not for sin. These offerings are brought as Thanksgiving offerings. They're brought as festival offerings, and they're brought as offerings of thanksgiving. Because remember that not all the offerings are due to sin. The first three that we talked about, the burnt offering, the mincha, the grain offering, and the shelamim, the peace offering, have to do with being grateful, celebration, petition, has nothing to do with sin. So these are going to continue with the third temple because it has nothing to do with sin. Yeshua took that role upon himself when he offered his life on the cross. Okay, so the past, the present, the future of the Beit HaMikdash or the temple is important because it's not only a building that's a temple. Yeshua's a temple, we are a temple, but there's also going to be a physical temple again. Now Leviticus chapters 1 through 15 teach us the way to God, how to get near to him, how to get close to him. Well, chapters 17 to 27 help us to walk with him, to continue in that walk. And it so happens that chapter 16 is right smack in the middle of these chapters that have to do with Yom Kippur. Why? Because Yom Kippur is the festival, was the celebration, or is the feast, in which all the contaminants of all the sins of all the year of all the people have contaminated all the way from the Holy of Holies to the outside altar. So it's the only day that the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies and starts cleaning house from inside out. That is the true and only offering that really cleans all types of sins. All types of sins. Okay. But remember that through this system, it was the superficial cleansing. It was a house cleaning. Only Yeshua's blood goes directly into our hearts, into our minds, and into our conscience. That's why he still had to come and offer himself. And as always, I ask you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel, share, like, and that way people, because I not only Spanish videos, I also have some English videos that I record. And so please share with other people. And with that, we finish this Torah portion, and hopefully if you have any questions or any comments, we can go over that.